And a very interesting question in this is how long water take travel time distribution. So this is just a representation, the first page of my dissertation. I did my PhD in Padua with Gianluca Bottera and Andrea Rinaldo as supervisors, and I just started 2 months ago a postdoc at the EPFL University in Switzerland, in Lausanne. Okay, I will give a brief introduction about what age distributions are, and I will try to be to say something that you all can understand. I didn't want to go too much into details of what I did. So what is age? It's a very intuitive thing. It's a time interval. So like if you have a precipitation event and you're tracking a precipitation input inside a catchment, the age of that input is the time interval since its entrance. So that's a pretty intuitive thing. So when you grab a jug of water from a stream, of course you have you have a distribution of water particles, and each water particle has entered a different time through a different precipitation event. And that's the reason for you don't have just one age, you have a distribution of ages in the stream water. Now, you don't have just an age associated with every water particle. You also have some concentration if you have some solids that enter the cycle. And so each single particle brings its contribution in terms of concentration. And that's the reason for when you sum up basically the concentration of all the water particles, you have the overall concentration that you can measure in the stream water. So that's a very important thing, because of course you cannot separate every single water particle. The only information you can get is like the integrated response of the whole grab of water that you have. So this is also the reason for there is this fundamental link between the water quality, that is the only thing you can measure, and the water age, which is the thing you're sometimes interested in. Now this is kind of like, it has some implication. This is just an example very close to here. This is the Venice Lagoon drainage basin, which has some problems in water quality. So the European water framework requires the water bodies to be at the good or even better ecological status, and in this catchment, in this drainage area, just the 11% of the water bodies reach the good ecological status. And this is mostly due to the nitrate loads, which are too high. Now, even when people try to reduce the fertilization load, because usually nitrate is associated with agriculture and manure activities, the problem is that the level tend to remain the same. And this is because when you're grabbing water, you have many water particles, and many of them are very old. So now you sample in the stream water that can easily be up to 2, 3, maybe even 5 years old. You have some particles which are very old and which still contain the old fertilization. And this is not just a local problem. This is another kind of famous example in the Chesapeake Bay, which is a very large drainage area in the United States, around the Washington, D.C. area. And some researchers from the US just studied precisely this problem of nitrate pollution, and they showed that even when you reduce completely, this is the green curve here, every nitrate input, of course this is a model, but the model says that even if you reduce completely, which is impossible of course, every load to the drainage bay, you would see a significant change after, when this study this was in 2014, I think, like after 6 years. So this gives you an idea of how like the persistency of the solids can be in the waters. Now, there are some like details that can be kind of problematic when studying hydrologic transport. The very first thing is that the hydrologic response of a catchment is different from the hydrologic transport of the particles. Just better tell you. Everyone knows that usually the hydrologic response of a catchment is like a few hours to a couple of days. You have an intense storm event, and then you have the discharge peak. The point is that the water in the discharge peak is not only made up of the water that just fell in the catchment with the storm event. Of course, there is some water particles out from that storm event, and usually not that much. Like, just to give some numbers, it is usually not more than 10 to 30%. So this is just a very general number. Of course, it depends on the catchment, on the conditions, and so on. But this is just to say that you can easily say this, because if you look, like this is just an example. This is a catchment which is very reactive to to storm events. You can see like rainfall and the stream discharge are more or less synchronized. But if you look at the chloride concentration, like precipitation has very intense spikes, and the discharge is more or less the same. So of course, if all the discharge were made of the precipitation event that fell here, you would have the same discharge concentration, but it's actually very different. So you can basically see that water mixes inside the catchments, and so like the signal of the new water is really dispersed in the discharge. This is just like one of the first reasons for hydrologic transport isn't so simple. Another reason is because it's a very dynamic process. So the catchment can have very different conditions. Sometimes it's very wet, you have precipitation, you have a lot of water that is moving toward the stream. But in some other cases it's dry, so water tends to stand still. You have a lot of evapotranspiration that is removing water. And usually you can also see this in the water quality. Like this is a dry period where the concentration kind of goes back towards a sort of background concentration. And then you see that during the peak event, you have a lot of variation. So it's different transport processes in different times of the hydrologic response. One final reason for hydraulic transport isn't so simple is because you can think of this intuitive picture of the travel time distribution being a sort of a filter of the input concentration into some output concentration. But the problem is that the filter is not like a nice and smooth curve. Usually it's very irregular, and this is because it's very linked to the previous precipitation events, which are very irregular. You know, precipitation is one of the most irregular variables that people deal with, especially in hydrology. So, okay, this was basically just some ideas of the reasons for it is not so intuitive talking about hydrologic transport. This is just a nice, simple way to show the process. You have several precipitation events, and then water mixes when it is in the storage, and then some water particles reach the discharge. So at this point, you can separate between the ages, so the water particle and the ages which make the storage of the system, and those that make the discharge. Now, in general, these two distributions are different because you have different processes that lead to particles forming discharge. And in particular, I would like to draw your attention to these three inputs. If you see, like the red one was the first one that was injected, then the yellow, and then the blue one, which is the youngest, then. And in this simple example, you have that these inputs are preferentially present in the discharge rather than in the storage. This was the first thing I would like you to see. And the other one is that I draw here a lot of gray bars because it means that like most of the water that is in the stream was contained in the storage before I started the animation, just to give an idea of its longer travel times. Okay, now if you want to like characterize this process of how water is preferentially sampled in the discharge rather than in the storage, you can take the ratio between these two distributions. And when you do this, you can define the so-called storage selection function, which has, let me say, just three typical shapes. When you have a preference for the younger ages, which is this shape, because it means that you see you have that the youngest water particles are more present in the discharge than in the storage, and you have the opposite when you have a preference for the older ages, and then you have a sort of condition in between when you have a sort of a well mix, which we call random sampling scheme. Okay, this was just some background. I hope I did not go too far into the storage selection function description. And now, really, like my contribution. Well, this is the dissertation overview. This is the logical order I call, because I have like the first two chapters are about theoretical advances in the field, and then I have three applications. The point is that this is a logical order, but this is not how I got to those results, and the chronological order is kind of more messy. But as this is a PhD meeting, I thought about presenting the results not in the most logical order, but in the order that I worked with. Like, I think that can be kind of more instructive for you. And so let's start from the first application. I started not with a theory, I started with applications. And this is because we had already some nice ideas about how things work, and we needed to see if this was actually working or not. So I had a nice opportunity to work with people from the Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and I had some data about this nice agricultural catchment where they have, due to the fertilization, the presence of some chloride. Now, the very interesting feature of this catchment is that chloride is present due to fertilization, but the fertilization is over during the winter period because farmers are not fertilizing during that period. They cannot. It's by law that they cannot. And so how is it possible that the concentration remains so high in the winter period if there is no input in the stream, in the catchment and in the stream? So this was basically like the very first simple research question that I dealt with is how can we actually say something about this using this nice time variant travel time distribution theory? And so we developed a very simple lump model. I don't want to describe too much, but it's made out of two compartments, like a soil storage and a groundwater storage compartment that interact among each other. And the model is able to predict the, for example, the mean travel time in the soil water and in the groundwater. And it was nice to start and see and to play with this a bit to see how changing the parameters. You see the variations in the mean travel times, for example, or you can. I was surprised to see how like these small little variations are characterizing the soil water from the model, according to the model, of course, while the groundwater is reacting to much longer time scale, climatic time scales. Anyway, the results were like kind of decent. And the very nice thing is that the model was able to reproduce both the dilution of the signal, but also the fact that the signal during the recession of the hydrograph were going back to some sort of background concentration. And actually this was showing that you typically have during the peak events like some younger water particles that are discharged because you see also the effect of the storm events. But then you go back to water particles that have 2 to 3 years, and they have their concentration in terms of chloride. So in those periods, even if you have more input, you are discharging water which is old, so which has input from the previous years of fertilization. This was just the very first application, and yeah. In the meanwhile, we were working on a sort of a parallel track, and we had what I was describing before was this sort of a spatially integrated distribution. So it's like the storage age is the age of the whole storage. You don't care if it is locally one place or another one, and the same for discharge. But then there are some other descriptions which are very local, and this is just a way to describe it is through this age mass density. Basically, you have a distribution for every point in space. Like the only difference from this variable and this variable is that there is the spatial component. Now, how can we link these two different approaches? If we describe this through an advection dispersion process, how are the ages mixing in such a system? So the very first thing was taking this advection dispersion equation for the age mass density and basically just integrating over the control volume or in the outfluxes to derive the spatially integrated variables that we were interested in. And then if we take the ratio between the two, we have again that so-called storage selection function. Now, we solved for a very simple, linear, monodimensional, constant advection velocity, and like the simplest case, we solved the advection dispersion equation to get an explicit result for ρ, and this way we could get like an analytical, well not analytical, but like a solution for the storage and the discharge age distributions. So now, like depending, for example, on the Peclet number, you can force the system with some stochastic mass input or whatever, and you can start see what happens in an advection dispersion system from the point of view of ages. So now this is just an example. You can study how the storage selection function changes depending on the Peclet number, or you can take a fixed Peclet number and see changing different the boundary conditions and how the storage selection function reacts to this. And so this was another work which was a very theoretical one, but we were happy to see that some kind of typical shapes, like the so-called random sampling one, it tends to be kind of a recurring one when there is a lot of dispersion. This makes sense. I mean, if you have not a strong advection component, water tends to mix more, and so every time you're sampling in the stream water that has like a uniform distribution of ages, basically. Okay, after this, I had the nice opportunity to spend some time abroad. I was in Virginia, at Virginia Tech University with Professor Kevin McGuire, and I went to a big convention that is taking place every year in San Francisco, and I had the opportunity to work, to get to know this professor, Jane Kirshner. And so with this professor, which was managing some very high frequency data, we started working again on the applications. So this signal has some interesting feature. It's a very high frequency. It's every 7 hours, and you have a lot of spikes, but if you remember the previous example, like the Dutch catchment, they had just dilution, so negative peaks here. And this one also had some positive peaks. So we had, well, maybe, I mean, we have a model that was able to reproduce the negative peaks. Maybe we can get like some results also for the positive ones. And so the research question again was kind of a simple one, but how can we explain this very high frequency dynamics? And so once again, we set up a model, like a very simple model, like the one you saw before, and this was the calibrated model for the discharge, and this is for the concentration, and beside this negative peak that we always wonder how it could have been reproduced. But like the others, I mean, there are both the positive ones and the negative ones. And this was nice because we could see that the dynamic basically was a single dynamic, like the catchment has a preference for the younger ages which are present in the storage, but these younger ages in some parts of the year have a higher concentration with respect to the background because precipitation inputs have a higher concentration. It's a seasonality in the pattern. And in some other parts of the year you have a lower concentration in the input. So if you have preferentially those water particles, they tend to dilute the signal. And also studying some age dynamics, we could see that the discharge is very erratic, like the distributions can really change a lot during the year, while the storage is of course less sensitive to new precipitation events because a large storage is slightly affected by little variations in precipitation. And we could also derive this storage selection function, which we could see has in general the preference for the younger ages, which means that discharge on average is kind of sampling the youngest water particles in the storage. And this can be linked with the storage state and so on. I just don't want to go too much into detail. Okay, then also working with the professor from the Virginia Tech University, I could work on some other catchment. And in this case, this is a forested catchment in the United States, in New Hampshire, which is up here. This catchment, we had some silica measurements, and silica is interesting because it's a non-conservative solid. It's produced basically in the soil, and the concentration of silica depends on how water remains in touch with the mineral interface. And so, I mean, the contact time between the mineral and the fluid is strictly linked with the travel time. So if we can model the travel time, maybe we can also model like this kind of non-conservative transport, and that's what we try. So can we model some age-dependent transport with our age models? And again, like the model is, you see, kind of simple as the one I showed you before, just there is this sort of buffer zone around the stream because it's a particular catchment which had this very humid areas all around the stream. And this is the result in terms of the solid that we use for the age distributions, which is deuterium, which was considered basically as a solid. And in this case as well, we could see like strong differences between the wet period and dry periods. Of course, wet periods have younger age distributions. And so after this, like we were able to calculate the discharge age distribution, and we basically implemented a simple first-order chemical kinetics. So every water particle has a concentration which depends on how long the particle stayed in touch with the mineral interface. But then you need to sum up all the particles with that age and weight on how much they are present in discharge. I mean, if you have just very few particles which are very old, they have a high concentration, but they are very few. So you need to see the thing from the overall point of view. And basically the idea is that when you have dry days, you have many old particles which have a high concentration component, and in the wet days you have many young particles which bring their own contribution. And this allowed us to simulate 14 years of silicon and sodium, which is also in this catchment mostly produced by mineral weathering. Yeah, and this also like kind of allowed us to say that the typical reaction time, like the characteristic reaction time, is about 10 to 13 days. So particles that say for 40 days they reach the equilibrium concentration, and so all the particles which are older than 30 days basically bring the same information to the overall signal. And so it's particles younger than say 20 days that really drive the water quality for this solid. Okay, now at the end of the PhD, basically, after I worked, after I worked on applications and also on some theoretical stuff, I was able to see basically like the picture all together. And so at that time, I could actually work on the most theoretical work, which is in the end the first chapter of my dissertation. So it was funny to me to see that the last work is actually the first chapter, but it makes sense in a logical order. So I don't know how much time left I have.
5 minutes.
Okay, so we have all the time we need. Just going back, so we just talked about age. So when you inject a water particle and you stop at some point, when the particle is in storage, you can define the age, as we said before, is the time interval with respect to the injection time, so to a past event. But you can also define actually the life expectancy, which is how long it will take from now to leave the catchment. And yeah, this is just the animation. And with this, this is important because when you inject something like in a lysimeter experiment, you are actually tracking the life expectancy of your injection because you are looking at the future time at which the solid will live. On the other hand, when you take water quality measurements, you are basically studying the previous injection time. You have several water particles that entered in different times and you're sampling them all together at the exit time. It's kind of slightly different processes. And what is so the link between this kind of forward and backward age tracking? Now, if you have precipitation, well, it doesn't make any sense to track the age. Like every precipitation input has no age. I mean, it has zero age because all the particles are, by definition, they have zero age. But they have a life expectancy distribution, which is the travel time distribution. If you consider the storage, particles which are in storage, they have an age, but they also have a life expectancy because you can wonder both when they entered or when they will leave. And if you take the discharge or any other output, it could be also evapotranspiration, you can only wonder when they enter the catchment because by definition, they are leaving the catchment. They have no more life expectancy. This was just the basis to try to write a sort of a master equation generator, I called, which is just a single equation that can describe both the forward and the backward process. I really will not go into detail about this, just to say that it was possible to describe different processes with the same equation. And of course, then with the simulation, like using the forward or backward storage selection function, you can really simulate the life expectancy of an injection or the water quality evolution in a stream. This is just some examples. I would like to just show you a very last example, which is not really hydrologic, which was not in my dissertation, but I always like it because if you consider water particles as a dynamic population, which gets older while it travels through the catchment, well, you can do the same with real population, not just water population. So I took just some data from the United States because they have a lot of data about this thing. And you can see the population by age class in the different years. So you can clearly see the baby boom in the 60s, which then propagates in time. It's very clear to see the process. And also the curve is kind of getting higher because of immigration. But when you normalize it, of course, it just changes. This is not normalized distribution. You can do the same thing for the discharge age distribution, which is basically the age at which people die, and of course it's mostly older people that die, but there is also an infant mortality component. So I said, well, we were studying the storage selection function for the water, what about studying the same thing for the population? So if you take the distribution, just once again you take the ratio between the two, and what you get is actually a very clear message, is that regardless of the time, it's always like the oldest people that die. But you also see the trace of the progress in reducing from the 40s to now the infant mortality. So this is kind of an informative picture of the whole process. Okay, just a brief summary of the results because I worked on this. Now this is again in the logical, not in the chronological order. I studied a lot in this age and life expectancy distributions and how they are linked among it, depending if you are considering the storage or the outfluxes, and also to kind of frame this this concept in advection dispersion systems. And then some applications, producing hydrochemical models, applying to different catchments, also the last application with silica, so working with non-conservative solids. And this is, like, in general, really helped a lot, at least me, to understand how catchment works, how they release water and release solids. I just want to thank people that gave me data to work with, because otherwise it was really impossible to produce any single result. And this is my last slide, so thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for your nice presentation. We have time for some questions.
A question about the model. It seems that you use the lumped model, so you don't look at the spatial distribution of the phenomena. But after all, you speak the whole time about the travel time, and do you think that it will be interesting to see the wave propagation phenomena, flow propagation phenomena, and if yes, do you think that it's possible?
That's a very good question, of course. So the very first thing is that usually, so the time in the river network is usually much short, usually, not always of course, but much shorter than the time in the catchment. So, like, when it is small compared to a big time, you know, you can think, you can just not consider it. Of course you should. The other thing, it would be very interesting to see also how, like, spatially distinct sources are providing the stream with water on different ages, because of course a catchment is not anything but it's not uniform at all. It has huge differences, and it was extremely interesting to see how the different catchment characteristics affect the water age and also the water quality. The problem is that having data to calibrate the models is extremely difficult, because even if you, like, dig some wells and you take some water sample, you're really sampling just one point, and you have a whole catchment of square kilometers. So having, like, a large enough sample, but not as big as the whole catchment is kind of difficult. Sometimes people have nested catchments, which is interesting because you have 2 or 3 small catchments, and then you can sample them at the outlet, and then to see the effect of the single subcatchments to the final outlet. The problem is that then you need to have discharge samples from, for example, 4 different places, and this is very expensive because you need to have high frequency, not to lose the temporal accuracy, but also longer term, at least a couple of years. And so far, I just know of that database I showed you before from the UK catchment, which had 2 years of 7-hour frequency, and it was a huge project. It was a very expensive project. So the answer is yes, it would be extremely interesting, but also at the moment kind of far from reachable.
Any other questions?
How difficult would be to adopt a theory to describe, for instance, temperatures? Since then temperatures are very important for eco-hydrological problems.
I mean, there is, of course, an important, say, reactive component, because it's not a conservative property. I think as long as the reaction component is not dominant, this could actually be applied. If you can describe with, or if you can describe with some simple kind of kinetic approach the variations in the temperature from the different sources, for example, from the soil water, say, and the groundwater, I think this actually could be done. And of course, there are a lot of temperature data which make this thing very interesting.
So, any other question?
Maybe it was too complicated if there are no questions.
Okay.
Sorry, I've seen that you work with silica and chloride data. Do you think it is possible to apply the model with electrical conductivity data?
I think so. I really think so. I never worked directly with electric conductivity. Just some people told me that it gives some problems sometimes, especially for the. I don't know if you're talking about injection experiments where you can control how much you are basically injecting. Because if you don't have a strong signal, when you are close to the noise level, it is very difficult to really detect the variation in electric conductivity. Like, I would say better, to relate the variations in electric conductivity to hydrological processes and not to some other kind of random processes.
Okay.
I have another question. Assume that there is a new student entering a PhD. More or less, he doesn't know anything about all the whole stuff. What do you suggest she has to do to learn all this stuff? Where she has to start, or he has to start?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. So I hope, like the final work I talked about, which is the first chapter of my thesis, which was published a few months ago, is kind of, I tried to be very kind of didactical. So that could be a start. But I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of publications, of course. And
Maybe too many.
Yeah, exactly. There are too many publications.
yeah, but many of them are, I don't know. I mean, there is a, I mean, I think you see that the newer ones kind of include the previous ones. Like the previous ones really help to, and people built upon those. So I think like the last ones already should be, I don't know, complete enough. But because then you have the applications, but those are kind of different things. But for the theory, I don't know. I think this last one may be easy to read, and there is a like a, kind of summary of the previous results.
Okay, so I think